I'm Snehal, and today I'll be showing you how I recreated the dress that Constance Wu wore at the end of the movie for Crazy Rich Asians from tulle, and I recreated this from scratch. So continue watching the video to find out how I recreated it. So here are the materials I used. I used 40 yards of tulle to make this dress. I wasn't expecting to use all 40 yards that I bought, but I ended up using all of the tulle so that the lining wasn't super visible. I cut out the lining from the bodice from an old satin dress and used a petticoat that I already had as the base layer for the skirt. But if you want to make the skirt from scratch, you can use about 2.5 yards of lining fabric to make an A-line skirt, and I'd recommend using satin for the lining layer. I used white thread, but I'd also recommend using a thread that closely matches the color of your tulle, since all seams are visible through tulle. I used 2 scissors because one pair of scissors always seemed to be lost in my room among the vast amount of tulle. For closing the skirt, I used a ribbon and 2 snap closures. I also made the tulle flowers over an open flame using a candle and a lighter. For the bodice lining, I took a basic bodice block that I created using my measurements, and I cut out 2 pieces of that bodice block on a fold so that my 2 bodice pieces are mirror images of each other. I'll link the tutorial I used to create my bodice block in the description box below. To make an A-line skirt for the skirt lining, cut out 2 trapezoids of your lining fabric with the measurements on the screen. So the measurements should be for the waist, you should cut out half of the waist measurement, and for the length, you should cut out the length of the skirt you want, which preferably would be your waist to the ankle so that the lining doesn't reach all the way near to the bottom, because you do want the tulle to be a little longer than the lining. Make sure to leave an inch on both sides of the waist and the top and the bottom of the skirt for seam allowance, hemming, and making a channel to thread the ribbon through around the waist. For the tulle skirt, I used 3 circle skirts layered on top of 6 gathered skirts. I cut the circle skirt out of the tulle using the pattern on the screen and cut out 3 rectangles the same height as a circle skirt, but 3 times my waist measurement and length so that I could gather one side to fit my waist. Tulle is still very thin when gathered, so it's a good idea to cut a long strip of fabric when gathering tulle. For the bodice, I cut out 6 rectangles that were the height of my bodice and twice as long as my bodice, but I'd recommend keeping the length at 3 times the length of your bodice pattern so that it looks like there's more tulle when it's gathered. I also cut out 2 large rectangles of tulle so that I could use tulle from the bodice to wrap around my back and create a belt, and I cut out another 2 large rectangles of the same size so that I could make cape sleeves or tie these around the crisscross in my back to create a bow. Lastly, I cut out about 140 tulle circles and 3 different sizes for the flowers. For the circle skirt, I folded the fabric in half and then folded it over again to create a triangle like this. I then measured my waist measurement and divided that by 2 pi from the corner and marked that along the skirt. After that, I measured the length of the skirt from the line I just marked, and I marked another line using pins. I wanted this gown to be floor length with my heels, so I tried on my heels and then measured the length from my waist to the floor. Unfortunately, my fabric was not wide enough to cut a full circle skirt. Because this is 54 inches wide, I need 108 inches wide fabric for cutting a full circle skirt. That is the length of a gown. So I cut out 2 halves of a circle skirt to sew them together at the sides. I therefore repeated the process of making a half of the circle skirt 5 more times for 6 halves or 3 whole circle skirts. This is what the 6 halves of the circle skirt look like after I cut them out. In order to attach the 6 halves to make 3 circle skirts, I sewed 2 halves together at both sides with a zigzag stitch and repeated this twice more for 3 circle skirts. I put the tulle skirts inside each other, aligned the waist of all of the tulle skirts, and then sewed the waist of the 3 circle skirts onto the waistband of my petticoat. I then cut the tulle in the center back about 6 inches so that I could fit the skirt over my hips. To close the skirt, I added 2 snap closures to the lining fabric. and folded the waistband of the skirt to create a channel to thread a ribbon through. I then used this ribbon to tie the skirt as tight as I wanted it at the waistband. I would have used an invisible zipper, but this tool would likely snag on the zipper, so I ended up using a ribbon closure. After trying on the skirt, however, I realized that the petticoat was very visible through the tool, so I decided to add more layers of tulle to cover the lining more. I gathered the 6 tulle rectangles, sewed 2 of them 2 inches below the waistband, and gathered 4 of them and sewed them 6 inches below the waistband. I didn't want to sew them onto the waistband because I did not want the waist to look too full. I hand sewed all gathering using a running stitch since I was having a hard time gathering tulle with machine basting stitches. I also ended up hand sewing the last 4 gathered layers around the hip area 6 inches below the waistband of the skirt onto the petticoat because every time I tried to fit under a machine, my machine's presser foot would get caught in the tulle and then I'd have to cut out the fabric and start over. And after about 5 times of doing this, I was tired and just decided to hand sew the rest of that. I sewed all gathered layers under the 3 circle skirts. For the bodice lining, I used my basic bodice block to cut out 2 pieces of the bodice from the lining. I made this basic bodice block myself using my own measurements, and I'll link the tutorial I used to make my basic bodice block below. Make sure to cut on a fold so that your bodice pieces are mirror images of each other. I then taped the top of the bodice lining to my shoulder and draped the bodice on my body until I was happy with how it fit. I marked all adjustments to a bodice with pins and then sewed using the pins as a guideline. Here's what the 2 bodice pieces look like after sewing all the darts. I ended up adding a bust dart for better fit and folded in the neckline to create a plunging neckline. I cut out 4 strips of tulle that are 3 yards long and twice as wide as the length of the bodice. In order to do this, I cut once on the fold of the tulle and then I cut again after folding it in half again. I used 2 of these straps to create a crisscross design in the back, and then pulled those 2 straps to the front to tie around my waist. I added little belt loops with thread in the back of the skirt for the tulle straps to go through after they crisscrossed around my back, so that the entire belt sat on my waist, and I used the other 2 strips of tulle to tie around the crisscross in the back to create a bow. I put 6 tulle rectangles that are as tall as my bodice and twice as wide as my bodice on top of each other. I put 2 strips of tulle on top of these 6 layers. After that, I hand sewed gathering and sewed the gathered layers to my bodice and cut off the excess fabric. After trying on the skirt and pinning the bodice panels to the skirt on myself, I sewed the bodice panels to the skirt. Here's what the dress looks like after I sewed the bodice panels and the belt on. I hand sewed a belt on the waistband from scraps of tulle for a cleaner finish. I wasn't able to film myself making the flowers since it was 1 AM and I was too tired to take my tripod downstairs to my kitchen, but I'll link the tutorial I used to make the flowers in the description box below. I sewed 7 flowers on the right of the dress bodice, 4 on the left bodice, and 3 onto the belt. And here is the finished product. That's all I had for you guys today. If you liked this video, please make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe, and also turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss out on the next time that I post. And feel free to comment down below if you need any tips on working with tulle or any questions on how I made this dress. Thank you so much for watching.